welcome to the second live workshop for July. We went through a method for simplifying values for each object into only two values, one for light and one for shadow. But we're going to add two more today. And I'm going to add halftone, which belongs to the light, and reflected light, which belongs to the shadow. I've got some cold pressed linseed oil here and a rough hog brush. Get some linseed oil on the brush and just cover the panel. You don't want it too thick, but equally you need to make sure that it's covered. And then I'm going to take some of the value 7 . Get a bit of that on the same brush, cover the panel. A lot of the reason for doing this is just that it gives you something to work with, so it breaks the flat white panel, so you don't get so much fear. And then I use a kitchen roll and just wipe some of it off, so it's slightly toned. It's still fairly light. So the next thing I want to do is stick a grid on here. Now I usually use a flat. Now this is just a cheapie flat with quite a thin kind of a chisel end. Get a bit of paint on it, and I wipe it off. And you can measure. There's no harm in measuring for grids, you know, and that just like there's no harm in using a grid, especially for something like this. People get a bit snotty about using grids or working from photos, all this kind of stuff. Now, if you know me, if you've been following me for any length of time, you will know that I mostly work from life, and I have for about 10 years. Lately, I've found, because I have, probably longer than that actually, because I have for that long, I've evolved the process anyway from working from life, and I find now that when I work from photos, I end up with pretty much the same result as I would if I was working from life. So I've just divided this by eye halfway through, then divided it again. So the gridded version is the aspect ratio of that image that I gave you actually matches the aspect ratio of this panel, which is 7 by 5 inches. So I usually start with the furthest left point. This is basic sight size, right? So sight size, in a sense, because you're putting a plumb line in front of your subject, it's basically working with a one-line grid, and you do measurements, careful measurements from those. But the basic approach of finding the overall envelope, like the big shape, is a good one for any approach, you know. So this is, I would say, that's my furthest left point, this garlic bulb here, and the furthest right point of the garlic bulbs is right over here. So then I want the lowest point, which is just about here. Could do them by eye. And having a grid doesn't absolve you of still judging distances. You know, it's a nonsense to say that it's a crutch and you should throw it away and you're not a professional or something if you do it that way. And the highest point is going to be about over here. If you were here for the one earlier this month on drawing accuracy, I think I talked a little bit about grids then, using them. You still have to judge. You're just judging smaller distances, and it's easier to judge smaller distances more accurately than large distances, you know. So you can pretty much, at this point, you can pretty much draw what they call an envelope of the shape. So if this is our highest point there, it's coming out to here, which is our furthest right. This then comes down to the bottom, and then out the furthest left. And you can see immediately we're going up to the top there, where everything is going to fit. Everything has to fit within this envelope, which is why they call it an envelope. Okay. Some bits are going to go outside of the lines, but nothing goes beyond these points. Now, one of the things that you'll hear a lot about halftones and reflected light is that halftones belong to the light and reflected light belongs to the shadow. People will tell you that. So this, so we've got this sphere here, we've got the light side and then we've got the shadow side. And the reflected light is under here and then the halftones are here. And people will tell you that it's a kind of, it's often repeated as if it's just a given, is that the halftone is always lighter than the reflected light. Now, me personally, I like to test these things. Anytime I hear something like that, I'm like, I wonder if that's really true. So I spent some time testing that with spheres of a lot of different local values and with different local values of the ground that they were sitting on, because that's where the reflected light comes from. And actually, the reflected light can be as light as the half tones if the surface that's reflecting the light onto the object is very close and if it's a very high value. Quite often the reflected light can be about the same value. So I'm going to do the background first. Okay, and the main areas that I'm interested in the values for is here, this dark shadow here, and this light part here. Now this being lighter than the light side of the garlic bulb, by enough, is going to be really important to show. Okay. So back here is going to be right down the value scale, so it's going to be probably slightly darker than this, obviously a bit lighter than the black, so right back here is probably going to be a little bit between the two. Now when I've got a fresh brush out, doesn't matter what brushes you use for this, by the way, you'll just get a different kind of a mark. I usually get a little bit of oil on it and then wipe it off just to kind of work it in a bit. And then I'm going to mix that value. I know I want it to be between these two. If you have already mixed the 9-step value scale that's on the image, on the photo, the reference photo, then you can just use that. Everything has to have a place to sit on the scale. Don't just think, well, this needs to be more different than the value next to it, so I'm going to lighten it or I'm going to darken it. Because you always have to relate everything back to the whole. And if you start changing local relationships too much, like say I've got this in and then I put a value here for the light part, I think there's not enough difference between them, so I make this lighter, then that would affect how everything else looks. So I'm just going to, I know that that's my dark value in the background there. That's going to be about right for me there. Now the light part around here, probably going to be about the middle of the value range, very slightly higher. I'm going to use a different brush for that. I go through a lot of brushes when I'm painting because I like to keep them kind of clean, and I try to keep a brush for the lights, a brush for the darks, and a brush for the middle in value studies, although invariably I mess them up at some point. So it's about a value 5, and I'm going to go slightly lighter, bring in a little bit of the 7, just a little bit. Forgot to put any oil on that brush. I'm going to have that about there. I'm not going to do any edge handling yet, mostly because I like to show that separately so you can kind of see what happens when you start to treat the edges. We'll do a bit of that at the end. Just describe the shapes. And the background at the top, it gets quite a bit lighter by the time you get over here. It's not that light, it's somewhere between the two, but it's closer to this one, closer to this value. The third one that I have out, I'm on about this area up here. I'm going to use this darks brush, so I want something that's a little bit lighter than this. So the next thing I want to put in is the cast shadows. Now they're not, I don't think they're not quite as dark as this. They're probably about this kind of value here. These cast shadows here, cast by the garlic bulbs. So I don't want to use this value that I used for the darker side. I want, of the background, I want to go slightly lighter. For a value study, when you get to this point, when you've got the background and the grounding and a cast shadow, you start to, immediately, even though I haven't painted the garlic bulbs yet, there starts to be an impression of something there. So you want to be thinking, at the beginning of especially a value study like this, I think you want to be thinking in big shape terms and just values and relationships. It's much easier for us here. Well done, Renee. Much easier for us here because we've got the photo to work from and because I bunged the value scale on there, so you've got a kind of a visual check. But it's surprising, you know, how difficult it is to actually match the values just by looking at them. Which is why I always use my little, which you would have seen me use many times before, my little colour checker when I'm working from life. Which does basically exactly the same job as the little eyedropper tool in Photoshop. It lets you isolate the value. Because it's almost impossible to judge a value correctly when it's surrounded by other values. Our visual systems are just terrible at it. If you try to paint exactly the values you see and judge them by eye, you focus down more and more and more on one little area and the small value relationships there, and almost invariably you'll overstate the differences between the values, mostly because the value range in nature, the value range that you see is wider, much wider than the value range you paint. So you'll try and paint something that's closer to what you see in a small area, like say the difference between these values. I might think to myself, well, that's not it. They're not showing enough. I need to make one darker, or I need to make this lighter to make that stand out. And then you'll find that you've thrown something else out. Like say if I make this lighter, then this has to be lighter, then suddenly it's not so easy to see the difference between the light side of the garlic bulb and the ground. Everything affects everything else. So the challenge of values is keeping your attention on the whole thing all at once. I always go for the shadow side of the object. So I want the shadow side, and I don't want, when I'm looking at it, I don't want this area here, because that's the reflected light. I want it around here. This is a good area here and here. And because there's much less reflected light there, so I can get a general idea there for what the value of that shadow is. And it's a bit lighter than the cast shadow value, not a huge amount. It's not as high as the middle of the range, it's definitely lower than that. I'm going to get flats out now for painting this part. I'm going to use these two as my light and shadow. These are just synthetic flats, they're Da Vinci top acryl. They're not expensive, but they're pretty nice. Shadow side is going to be about here, I think. And although I need to put reflected light in it, I don't want to think about that yet. So this is what we were doing in April. Very simple light and shadow, okay? So I'm just going to take the shadow shape. Actually, I wonder if that's a bit, I think it should be, I think my cast shadow might be too light. My cast shadow is a little bit light. Might have to adjust it. The cast shadow needs to be a bit lower value, I think, than that. I'm going to adjust it down a little bit. It's like it's lower than this. It's between these two. Because I just put that value down for the shadow side, and it does need to be slightly lighter. So I'm going to darken the cast shadows just a little bit, so it's like between black and this value here. So if you've got your 9-step scale, it's the second one up from black, and it's going to mix with what's already there, so it would be slightly lighter still, but I think that's more what we want there. And if you find a bit where you're putting down, you can't see the edge of an object like here, because the value of the background here is about the same as the value of the shadow here, don't worry about it. People are tempted there, I think, a lot of the time to look into that bit and try and think, well, I need to show the edge of the shape. Take that edge and just go across it. We've got a shadow block. What we're interested in is value blocks. And although it may seem counterintuitive, that will help to create more form. Now we're starting to get an impression of something real form. As simple as that is, very little stuff has been painted so far. I'm going to just put in this cast shadow here from this stem at the back as well. I'm just going to put that in, but I just want to think about the shape of the shadow and nothing else, not about the stem. So you can probably guess what the next bit is. I want to put a general value for the light side of these, and it's not white. It's going to be probably between these two. So I'm going to get some of this one. Now this is my value 7 in this value scale. If that was it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It would be the 4th one up, or 1 down from white. I get a bit of that, some white, and mix one that's somewhere between. I want a bit of headroom because I want to be able to bring in some little highlights here and there. But it needs to be nice, and it needs to be well up the value range. I'm going to paint right up to the shadow. I'm not going to leave that area blank. So I want to add the next value factor, which would be the halftone. But before I do, I want to have a little bit of a look at the edge handling, okay? So where we have cast shadows, specifically here, I want to treat those edges a little bit to soften them. Now I'll show you a way that you can practice this. The thing about edges of cast shadows is that they're not the same all the way along. The edge of a cast shadow gets softer the further it moves away from the object that's casting it. So you need to be able to handle edges, but you also need to be able to have an edge get gradually softer and gradually harder. And I was lucky enough to learn a really handy way of doing this a long time ago, and it served me really well. So if I get a light value, like this one here, and if you're going to try this, you put the paint down fairly thick. If you don't have enough paint down, this won't work. You try and do it with a thin brush, with a thin layer of paint. All you'll do is you lift all of the paint off, and it won't work. It won't look good at all. You just paint a stripe, and then I'm going to get another value, paint a stripe of that next to it. And make sure there's plenty of paint on there. It's not really thin. And then I'm going to wipe off the brush a little bit. And you hatch across, right? So if I want this to be, say this was the edge of the object that was casting it, I'd want this to be harder here and getting gradually softer there. So if you just hatch across using small hatches at this point, getting gradually wider as you go down, right? And that's almost done it already. And then you get a soft, dry brush. So this is a well-worn watercolor synthetic. This is actually, I haven't done that very evenly. I'm just going to get that a bit more even there. This is Winsor & Newton set to gold. Lay it on really, like the kind of pressure you want is very, very light. Very light, like I'm barely kind of touching the, you know, and flick this brush around in my hand and then just drag down. Might want to do it a few times. And if you've got enough paint on there, you'll get an edge that starts off harder and then gets gradually softer as it moves away. And you can practice that as often as you like until you get really, really, really good at it. And don't be afraid to play with it, you know, if there's enough, if you've got enough on there. But don't do it too much, because the thing is that every time you, and try and get it so that it's a smooth gradation from hard to soft. Every time you drag this brush across, you're lifting paint, and that's why you have to have plenty of paint on there to start with. So if I want this edge I want it to be soft here and then to get really soft as it goes over here, I'll just hatch it. And then hatch it more as I get further over this way. I should have done this before I painted the light side, really would have made more sense. And drag. And if you, especially, this works extremely well if you're painting into a couch. And if you've got enough paint on there, I'm having to be a bit careful of this edge, which I basically spoiled. But, you know, you can get really nice effects this way. So here, this cast shadow, okay? This is going to be the hardest edge of the cast shadow, but it's not going to be as hard as this edge here. And it's going to get gradually softer as it moves away. More, bit more, more, out. And then get gradually tighter. But this edge of it here won't be as hard as this. Because this isn't where it touches the object. And then drag. Wipe this off, keep wiping this off. It needs to be fairly dry. And if you have enough paint on, and as I say, especially if you're working into a couch like this, you can, it's very light pressure that you're gliding the brush across. You get a really nice soft edge. Now the halftone belongs in the light. So our shadow value is around here. Our general light value is around here. Now for the halftone, I only want to go a small step down from here. So I'm going to go with this one, which is halfway between the middle of the value scale and white. It's still a lot lighter than the shadow. Okay? You need to make sure on a white object like this that it's a lot lighter than the shadow side. If the object was of a different local value, then obviously the halftone would be a slightly lower value. Everything would be shifted down. So I'm going to use my lights brush. This is the same brush that I used for painting the general light shape. And I'm mostly interested to begin with in this area between the light and the shadow. So I want to find areas where the value is not quite in the full light, but it hasn't turned to the shadow yet. So you see this bit here, where this form turns. The stem of the garlic turns and comes down into the body of the garlic. A lot of that it's in the light, but it's halftone. So most of that, I'll put the halftone value in for that area. Again, I'm not looking to find like exactly the values that are there. I'm thinking of this very much as a scale and making sure that my halftones are still in the light. They're still much lighter than the shadow. So all down here. I don't want hard edges here on these, so I'm going to soften these edges a little bit between the halftone and the light area. And then I'm going to use this brush, which I used for this here, to soften where I need to soften. But I'm going to be very careful and look carefully. So this edge that runs down here between the light and the shadow, it's quite hard here. But it's quite soft, and it gets gradually softer the further you move up here. And that shows the form, you know. So the reflected light is, it's a difficult one, this, because almost everybody does reflected light too light. You know, especially when you're learning. It's almost the same value as the shadow. Very, very small amount lighter than the shadow. So our shadow side was this value in between these two. So I'm going to go a little bit lighter than that, but nowhere near as high as that. No, still in the shadow. So I'm going to mix something that's slightly lighter than this value here. Hopefully it'll be light enough to show. I just want it to be just a little bit lighter. It's really, really easy to overstate. I'm going to get my shadow brush out. Back with the shadows. We're in the shadow world now. Get a little bit of this. It's hopefully this is going to be light enough to show. It's most obvious here. There's a little bit of the bulb showing, and then up here, some reflected light as well. This will be maybe just a tiny bit lighter than that to show. But be really careful with the value here. Just make sure that you don't stay in shadow world, don't go too light. And this one here has a lot of reflected light. In fact, almost all of this is reflected light. It gets a lot lighter around here. It also gives us a chance to kind of show the form a little bit more on this one back here. A lot of this is reflected light. And look back here. You know, I've hit the same value here as I have at the background. Just paint across take it out. So once those, they're fairly simple. Once those reflected lights are in, you want to soften the edge between the cast shadow and the reflected light, because this is all in shadow. So we don't want hard edges here. Do the same thing, I'm going to hatch a little bit, and wipe off this and then drag. Nice soft edges in there. And we're pretty much done. I would also be inclined to put in some light lights. So if I get a little bit of the lightest light, titanium white is the lightest value you can get. And just on the really lightest parts, I put it in pretty thick, like around here. I suppose you could call this highlights, but it's basically, this is only going to work because we did everything else so carefully. It's organizing the values really is what you're doing. And then the little touches at the end, which are the interesting bits, and the bits that are fun to do, they become really quite, you could just lay them in and they just bring the thing to life. So I'm going to bring a little bit of the lightest value down there. On the back one, stem, I'm going to bring up with the highlight. And just this area here where it's pointing straight at the light, bring that up just with a bit of thick titanium white. I'm not going to mess with that. I kind of like that to be fairly roughly in. This edge is too hard there, but you know, I like to have a bit of texture in those. And if you have a fine enough brush, or if you have a flat like this, do you see those little hairy bits that stick out? And I'm just going to pop it up just for fun. And there's some little bits that are like sticking off the side. Flat brushes are really good for painting garlic as well, because you can get that kind of feeling of the little bits of skin that are flaking off around the side. You know, those things only work if the values are pretty much right. My favourite bit of this value study is this area here where it goes off into nothing. I think that's really helping it to have a lot of life down there. The only thing, the one last thing, it doesn't really need it to create the form, but the one last thing that I would add is the occlusion shadow here. I don't really think of it as it is a modelling factor, but it's just a something, to me it's just something to add at the end, you know. So I'm going to go in with the darks brush. I'm going to go in not quite black, close to it, but not quite. And it's just going to help put it in, and then I'm going to have to soften it once it's been done. These little bits just make the thing sit well on the surface, but again, they only work if everything else is pretty much right. If you've already described form, then these will work well. The occlusion shadow is an area, they call it occlusion because no light or very little light gets in there. There's one here too. Oh, didn't do that very neatly. Areas of slightly lower value, and just soften them. You will find, or at least I do anyway, perhaps because I'm not careful enough, that sometimes the occlusion shadow will lighten too much when I soften the edges of it, and I have to put it in again. I'm going to do it now. Because they're small, you know, small area. But they're more of occlusion shadows are more of a kind of a detail of the modelling factors, really. I don't place the same importance of them on them as the rest of the modelling factors, which I think are much more important to get the values right. Once you get to the occlusion shadow, you're basically adding something just a little bit below in value than everything else you've done.